David Chen was holding a gun to the chest of the most powerful woman in aerospace when he realized his grandfather had planned this moment 25 years ago. "Pull that trigger." Elena Volkov whispered, blood trickling from her temple where the jet's debris had struck her. "And Dr. Park dies in that collapse zone. Don't pull it, and my board destroys everything your grandfather died protecting." The Gulf Stream behind them was still burning. 72 hours ago, David had been a broke mechanic fixing crop dusters. Now he was pointing a weapon at a billionaire who'd just crashed a $75 million jet onto his runway, deliberately because she needed him to save a life and expose a conspiracy that could end commercial aviation forever. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story reaches across America. The wrench hit David Chen's toolbox at 6:47 a.m. with the kind of metallic ring that meant expensive damage. Damn it. He was under the belly of a 1974 Cessna 182, elbow deep in an oil change that should have taken 30 minutes but was approaching 2 hours because the previous owner had apparently installed the oil filter with a torque wrench and a prayer to a vengeful god. Sweat dripped into his eyes, despite the October chill, and his lower back was screaming in the way it did every morning since he turned 43. This was his life now. This was all his life would ever be. The thought came with the usual mix of resignation and shame that he'd learned to swallow like cheap whiskey. His wife Sarah had died believing he'd amount to something more than a small-town mechanic drowning in medical debt. His grandfather had died thinking David would carry on some legacy that David still didn't fully understand. They'd both been wrong. "David." Tom Brennan's voice crackled over the hangar radio, panic breaking through his usual morning calm. "We got an emergency inbound corporate jet, declaring total systems failure. You need to clear the main hangar. Now." David rolled out from under the Cessna, his shirt soaked through oil staining his hands black. Through the hangar's open door, he could see the morning sky clear blue, beautiful, perfect flying weather. Then he saw the smoke trail. A jet was coming in from the west. Dark smoke pouring from its starboard engine, descending way too fast, the kind of approach angle that meant the pilot had lost most of their control authority and was riding the aircraft down on a wing and a prayer. Jesus Christ. David was already running for the emergency kit, his radio in his hand. "Tom, what kind of jet?" "Gulfstream G700. Tom's voice was tight. "Pilot says she's got no hydraulics, no fly-by-wire, losing altitude at 800 feet per minute. She's got maybe 90 seconds to touchdown." David's stomach dropped. A G700 was a $75 million aircraft, one of the most sophisticated business jets ever built, packed with computers and fly-by-wire systems that made it nearly impossible to crash unless every single one of those systems failed simultaneously, which they apparently had. "Clear the runway," David barked into the radio. "Get our fire truck positioned at the 1,000-foot marker, tell Sam to foam the last 2,000 feet of asphalt, and Tom..." "Yeah." "Call 911. Tell them we're about to have a hull loss with casualties." David sprinted across the tarmac, his boots pounding asphalt, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could see the jet clearly now. Beautiful machine, sleek as a bullet, dying in the air. The landing gear was partially extended, the left main locked at a 45-degree angle like a broken leg. The control surfaces were twitching erratically. The pilot fighting a plane that had stopped obeying the laws of aerodynamics and was now purely subject to gravity and momentum. The jet crossed the runway threshold too fast, too high, nose up at an angle that made David's pilot instincts scream. The pilot was trying to bleed off speed, trying to stall the aircraft just above the runway, in a maneuver that required absolute precision and probably divine intervention. The G700 dropped like a stone from 30 feet up. The impact sounded like the end of the world, metal screaming against asphalt, the broken landing gear collapsing immediately, the fuselage belly slamming onto concrete at 140 knots. Sparks erupted like fireworks, the aircraft slewing sideways, the pilot somehow impossibly keeping the wings level as physics tried its best to cartwheel a $75 million jet into a fireball. It slid for what felt like forever, spinning slightly, leaving a trail of torn metal and burning fuel before finally grinding to a stop 300 yards down the runway, pointing directly at David like an accusation. He was running before his brain finished processing what he'd just witnessed. The cabin door blew outward, emergency explosive bolts, and a figure dropped from the opening, hit the ground in a combat roll that spoke of training, and came up moving fast, sprinting away from the aircraft. Not running in panic, running with purpose. The figure was small, compact, wearing a white shirt soaked black with sweat and what might be blood. Dark hair pulled back tight, moving like someone who'd practiced emergency egress until it was muscle memory. The figure turned and David saw her face for the first time. A woman, maybe 35, maybe 40, with sharp features and eyes like polished obsidian. No fear in those eyes, just calculation. She was looking directly at him. "You're David Chen," she said. Not a question. A statement of fact, delivered in a voice that carried absolute certainty, despite the crash she'd just walked away from. David skidded to a stop 10 feet from her, his emergency kit forgotten in his hands. "Ma'am, you need to get further from the aircraft if that fuel ignites." "It won't. I dumped fuel at altitude." She was already turning back toward the jet, pulling out her phone, photographing the damage with methodical precision. "I need this aircraft operational in 72 hours. David's brain stuttered. "I'm sorry, what?" 72 hours, 3 days. She moved closer to the wreckage, her phone's camera clicking steadily. 71 now, actually. I've been circling for the past hour waiting for dawn so I could see the runway clearly. "Ma'am, I think you might be in shock." "I'm not." She turned to face him again, and David saw that the blood on her temple was real, a gash above her left eye that should probably have stitches. "My name is Elena Volkov. I own Volkov Industries. That's my personal aircraft, which I deliberately crashed onto your runway because I need your help, and I have approximately 6 hours before my company's board of directors arrives here with lawyers to make sure you never give it to me." The morning suddenly felt surreal, like David had fallen asleep under the Cessna and was having a stress dream brought on by debt and desperation. You deliberately crashed a $75 million jet. $78 million with the custom modifications. Elena wiped blood from her eye with a casual gesture that suggested head wounds were a minor inconvenience. "And yes, it's the only way to get your attention that couldn't be intercepted or blocked by my board. Lady, I don't know what kind of corporate thriller you think you're starring in, but your grandfather was James Chen. He worked on classified atmospheric research at this airport from 1968 to 1991. In 1998, my father, Victor Volkov, offered him $10 million to partner on Project Overwatch, a program to map and navigate atmospheric collapse zones that threaten high-altitude aviation. Your grandfather refused. He said my father's methods were reckless and that rushing the research would cost lives. David felt ice water dump into his veins. How do you know about that? Because 25 years later, my father's reckless methods got my lead scientist killed. Elena's voice cracked for the first time, genuine emotion breaking through her corporate armor. Dr. Sarah Park disappeared 3 weeks ago during a research flight into a collapse zone. She's still alive. Her aircraft is transmitting a distress beacon, but she's trapped in an atmospheric dead zone that standard avionics can't navigate. And your grandfather, before he died, built the only technology that might be able to reach her. She pulled a tablet from inside her jacket, somehow intact, despite the crash, and thrust it toward David. The screen showed aerial photos of Clearwater Airport, some dating back to the 1970s, all annotated with technical notes in handwriting. David recognized with a jolt. His grandfather's handwriting. What the hell is this? Proof that James Chen spent 25 years collecting data on atmospheric degradation that every commercial airline and government agency has been ignoring because acknowledging it would crash the global aviation industry. Elena's eyes were burning now, fever bright with desperation or determination, or possibly both. Proof that we've been breaking the sky for decades, and we're maybe 10 years from commercial aviation becoming impossible without technology that doesn't exist. That's insane. That's physics. Elena turned back to her crashed jet. And in 6 hours, people from my board are going to arrive here and offer you $8 million to sell this airport so they can bulldoze it and bury every piece of evidence that could hold them legally responsible for Dr. Park's death and the cover-up of data that could prevent thousands of future crashes. David's phone buzzed. A text from Tom. 3 black SUVs just pulled into the airport entrance. Expensive-looking people getting out. They're early. Elena said, checking her own phone. Figures. Margaret Vance always was efficient. Who the hell is Margaret Vance? The woman who's about to offer you more money than you've ever seen in your life. Elena met his eyes, and David saw something there that looked almost like respect. The question is whether you're going to take it, or whether you're enough like your grandfather to tell them to go to hell. Margaret Vance wore a steel gray suit that probably cost more than David's truck, and a smile that suggested she ate mechanics like him for breakfast. Mr. Chen. She extended a hand with the practiced warmth of someone who'd negotiated hostile takeovers in boardrooms from New York to Singapore. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us on such short notice. Didn't realize I had a choice, David said, not shaking the offered hand. They were in the airport's single conference room, a generous term for what was basically a storage closet with a folding table. Vance had brought 3 lawyers each carrying briefcases that probably contained enough legal firepower to level a small city. They spread documents across the table with the efficiency of a pit crew at Daytona. Volkov Industries would like to acquire Clearwater Regional Airport. Vance said, her smile never wavering. We're prepared to offer $8 million guaranteed employment for all current staff for 2 years full benefits and a personal signing bonus of $500,000 for you. David looked at the papers, then at Elena, who stood in the corner of the room with her arms crossed, blood still drying on her temple, watching the proceedings like a prisoner at her own execution. Why? David asked. I'm sorry. Why do you want this place? David leaned back in his grandfather's old chair, inherited 6 years ago, when nobody else wanted the job of managing a dying airport. We're barely profitable. We serve crop dusters and flight students. The only thing special about Clearwater is 70 years of deferred maintenance and a mechanic who can't afford to fix his own truck. One of the lawyers cleared his throat. Mr. Chen. Volkov Industries is consolidating regional aviation assets as part of a strategic portfolio. That's corporate speak for none of your damn business, David interrupted. I'm asking what you really want. Vance's smile finally slipped just a fraction. Mr. Chen, you're being offered a life-changing amount of money. I suggest you focus on that rather than asking why you're willing to pay $8 million for something worth maybe $1 million on the open market. David pulled out his phone and opened a tab he'd been keeping since the lawyers arrived. I did some quick research while you were setting up. Volkov Industries stock is down 18% in the last month. Rumors of operational difficulties and internal investigations. And 3 weeks ago, one of your research aircraft disappeared during a classified flight. The lawyers exchanged glances. Vance's smile disappeared entirely. That incident is not relevant to... The hell it isn't. David stood. You're not here to buy an airport. You're here to bury evidence. Whatever my grandfather was working on, whatever Elena's scientist found, you want it gone before anyone can connect the dots. Mr. Chen, Vance said, her voice going cold. You're making extremely serious allegations without any evidence. Then prove me wrong. Tell me why you're really here. Silence fell over the room like a funeral shroud. Finally, Vance reached into her briefcase and pulled out a different set of documents. These weren't purchase agreements. These were complaints filed with the EPA, the FAA, and the County Zoning Board. Clearwater Regional Airport is operating in violation of 17 federal environmental regulations, Vance said quietly. Soil contamination from fuel storage, groundwater pollution, improper hazardous waste disposal. The FAA has identified 12 safety violations regarding runway maintenance, lighting systems, and emergency protocols. and the county has flagged your commercial operations license for operating outside permitted zones. David felt his stomach drop. That's bullshit. We pass inspection every year. You pass inspections because nobody's looking closely. But if someone were to file formal complaints trigger real investigations. Vance smiled again, and this time it was pure predator. Well, you'd probably lose your operating license within 6 months, and the cleanup costs alone would bankrupt you long before then. She slid the purchase agreement forward again. $8 million, Mr. Chen. Or we file these complaints tomorrow morning, and you lose everything anyway, except you walk away with nothing. David looked at the documents, at the lawyers, at the woman who'd just outlined exactly how they were going to destroy him if he didn't comply. Then he looked at Elena, still standing in the corner, and saw something in her expression he hadn't noticed before. She'd been expecting this. All of it. You knew they were coming today, David said quietly. You timed your crash for this exact moment. I timed it for maximum impact, Elena replied, pushing off the wall. Margaret, always a pleasure to see my board of directors acting in the company's best interests rather than their own. Ms. Volkov, Vance said, her voice hardening. You were explicitly instructed not to pursue the park investigation. Your actions over the past 3 weeks have violated multiple corporate policies. And your actions over the past 3 weeks have violated multiple federal laws. Elena pulled out her own tablet. I have email chains showing board members discussing the park problem and agreeing to delay rescue attempts because they might draw unwanted attention to research irregularities. That's conspiracy to commit negligent homicide at minimum. The lawyers stood simultaneously, their body language shifting from corporate negotiators to cornered animals. Those communications are protected under attorney-client privilege, not when they involve criminal conspiracy. Elena's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. And definitely not when I'm a 49% shareholder acting as a whistleblower. You're bluffing, Vance said. You release those documents, you destroy the company. Your shares become worthless. I'm already worth $600 million. Elena stepped forward. I don't need the money, Margaret. I need my scientist back alive. And I need to stop this board from covering up research that could prevent thousands of deaths. She turned to David. Your grandfather refused my father's money because he couldn't trust Victor's motives. He was right, my father cared more about being proven correct than about saving lives. Elena's voice softened. But I'm not my father. And unlike him, I'm not asking you to help me get rich. I'm asking you to help me save a life and expose a conspiracy that your grandfather spent 25 years documenting. David looked between Elena and Vance, between the purchase agreement and the threat of legal annihilation, between $8 million and a woman asking him to risk everything for someone he'd never met. His grandfather's voice whispered in his memory, sometimes doing the right thing costs everything. That's how you know it's right. Get out, David said quietly. Vance blinked. Excuse me. Get out of my airport. David stood, walking to the door and opening it. You can file whatever complaints you want. I'll see you in court. The lawyers were sputtering, gathering papers, but Vance remained seated, her eyes locked on David's. You're making a terrible mistake, Mr. Chen. That woman, she pointed at Elena, crashed a company aircraft, endangered lives, violated a dozen aviation regulations, all because she's obsessed with a scientist who's been dead for weeks. She's going to drag you down with her. Maybe. David held the door open. But at least I'll go down for something that matters. After they left, Tom appeared in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee that smelled like they'd been brewing since the Carter administration. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen, Tom said, handing David a cup, or the dumbest. Probably both. David took a sip and immediately regretted it. Jesus. Tom, when did you make this? Yesterday. Waste not, want not. Tom settled into a chair. So what now? Elena was already heading for the door. Now we have 71 hours to do the impossible. David, I need to show you what your grandfather built. Tom, I need you to keep those lawyers busy if they come back. And everyone—" She paused in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the morning light. "Needs to understand that if we fail, we're all probably going to jail." "Comforting," Tom muttered. "I don't do comfort," Elena replied. "I do results." She walked out, and after a moment David followed, leaving his coffee behind, leaving his comfortable resignation behind, following a woman who'd crashed into his life like a meteor and was asking him to help her do something his grandfather had died trying to accomplish. The Gulfstream sat on the runway, like a broken promise, smoke still rising from its engines. 71 hours until Dr. Park's rescue window closed. 71 hours until the lawyers came back with court orders and criminal charges. 71 hours to fix an aircraft that shouldn't be fixable and fly into conditions that shouldn't be survivable. David thought about his grandfather, about Sarah, about all the ways his life had become smaller and sadder over the years. Maybe it was time to make it bigger again, even if it killed him. The door to subsection C hadn't been opened in 8 years, and it showed. The hinges screamed when David applied pressure rust flaking off like dried blood. Elena stood behind him with a flashlight, her shadow stretching long across the hangar floor. "Your grandfather sealed this in 2007, she said. "Tom told me he heard him working down here at night, but nobody was allowed in." "Tom's got a big mouth," David muttered, applying more force to the door. Something inside gave way with a crack, and the door swung inward, releasing air that smelled like ozone and old electronics, and something else. Something that reminded David of his grandfather's workshop, coffee and cigarette smoke and determination. The stairs descended into darkness that seemed to swallow Elena's flashlight beam. David found a switch on the wall, flipped it, and nothing happened. "Circuit breaker's probably tripped," he said. "Been too long without power." Or someone cut the power deliberately. Elena was already moving down the stairs, her phone's light cutting through the gloom. "Your grandfather was paranoid about security in his final years. According to Tom, he spent 6 months installing independent power systems down here." David followed her down, his boots echoing on metal stairs that felt solid despite their age. The temperature dropped with each step, and by the time they reached the bottom, his breath was fogging in the beam of Elena's light. She'd stopped at the base of the stairs, her light fixed on something ahead. "Oh my God," she whispered. David moved past her and understood why she'd stopped. The underground facility stretched the entire length of the original hangar, maybe 200 feet, lined wall to wall with equipment that looked like it belonged in a Cold War bunker. Monitoring stations with cathode ray displays, banks of analog instruments, chart recorders, and atmospheric sensors connected to cables that ran up through the ceiling like mechanical veins. In the center sat a desk, and on that desk sat something that made David's chest tighten. His grandfather's reading glasses sitting atop a spiral-bound notebook, as if James Chen had just set them down and would be back any moment. "He was still working," David said quietly, "right up until he died." Elena moved to the nearest monitoring station, her fingers finding switches by instinct or prior knowledge. She flipped them, and lights began warming up across the facility, old vacuum tubes glowing orange in the darkness, creating pools of amber light that pushed back the shadows. "Independent power," she said. "Generator systems separate from the airport's main grid. Your grandfather really didn't want anyone shutting this down." More lights came on, revealing the full scope of what James Chen had built. This wasn't just a monitoring station. This was a complete research facility, hidden beneath a dying airport, collecting data for 25 years, while the world above ignored the warnings. David walked to the desk and picked up the notebook. The cover was labeled simply, "Final Observations 2015. He opened it. His grandfather's handwriting filled the page's precise engineering script mixed with personal notes that made David's throat tighten. March 15, 2015. David came by today with flowers for Sarah's birthday. He looked so tired. The medical bills are destroying him, and he won't ask for help. Stubborn like his mother. Like me. He asked if I was feeling all right. I lied and said yes. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months. I haven't told him. He has enough pain. David's hands were shaking. He turned the page. March 20th, 2015. Viktor Volkov died last week. Heart attack during a board meeting arguing with his daughter about the atmospheric research. Elena contacted me yesterday. She wants to continue her father's work, but she wants to do it right this time. She's offering partnership, full transparency, equal control. I told her no. Not because I don't trust her. I think I might actually, but because I won't be here to see it through. And David isn't ready. He's drowning in grief and debt, and he doesn't understand yet why this matters. But he will. When the collapse zones get worse. When the data becomes undeniable. When someone like Elena comes to him asking for help. I'm leaving him everything he needs. The equipment, the data, the analog system I designed but never tested. God forgive me, I'm leaving him a burden he never asked for. But I'm also leaving him a purpose. And sometimes that's the greatest gift one broken man can give another. David couldn't read anymore. He set the notebook down carefully, his vision blurring. David, Elena's voice was soft. Don't. He held up a hand. Just give me a minute. She gave him 5, moving quietly around the facility, familiarizing herself with the equipment. David used the time to breathe, to push down the grief that always waited just below his surface, to remember that his grandfather had been dying and hadn't told him, and had spent his final months preparing for this exact moment. There's more, Elena said finally. She was standing in front of a large metal cabinet labeled Atmospheric Data Archive 1987-2015. This is what my father spent 20 years trying to get access to. This is what the board wants buried. David joined her, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. What's in it? Proof. Elena opened the cabinet, revealing rows of data cartridges, each labeled with dates and coordinates. Proof that commercial aviation has been tearing holes in the upper atmosphere for decades. Proof that the collapse zones are growing, merging, becoming more dangerous. And proof, she pulled out a cartridge labeled Park Mission 2024, that Dr. Sarah Park's disappearance wasn't an accident. She inserted the cartridge into a nearby terminal. The screen flickered to life, showing flight data overlaid with atmospheric readings. This is from 3 weeks ago. Elena said, her voice tight. Sarah's last flight. Watch the atmospheric readings as she enters the collapse zone. The numbers on the screen began fluctuating wildly. Temperature, pressure, electromagnetic field strength, all going haywire in patterns that looked almost deliberate. It's not random, David said, his engineer's brain engaging despite his emotional state. There's a pattern, like the atmosphere is resonating, Elena finished. Exactly. The collapse zones aren't just areas of degradation. They're standing wave patterns created by decades of supersonic flight punching through the same atmospheric layers. We've literally been creating invisible walls in the sky. The flight data showed Sarah's aircraft encountering the zone boundary. All systems beginning to fail simultaneously, her attempts to turn back blocked by the zone's expansion. Then the data stopped. That's when we lost contact, Elena said. But look at this. She pulled up a different screen showing a weak signal pattern. Her emergency beacon, still transmitting, which means the aircraft is intact and powered. She's alive, David. Trapped in the zone but alive. For how long? The beacon's been getting weaker, based on battery capacity and environmental drain. Elena's voice cracked. Maybe 48 hours, 60 at most. David looked at the monitoring equipment, at the data proving the sky was broken, at the evidence that could save a life and destroy an industry. You said my grandfather built an analog system, he said. Something that could navigate the collapse zones. Elena moved to a corner of the facility, where a tarp covered something large. She pulled it off, revealing a footlocker covered in warning stickers and secured with a combination lock. Locker 7, she said. Your grandfather's final project. He left instructions. She pulled out a sealed envelope from behind the locker, that it should only be opened by you. David took the envelope. It was addressed in his grandfather's handwriting. For David when you're ready. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The photo showed his grandfather standing next to Elena's father. Both men younger, both smiling in front of an aircraft David didn't recognize. On the back, his grandfather had written, "Victor and me, 1989, before we understood the cost of being right." The letter was brief, David. If you're reading this, Elena Volkov has come to you for help. I pray you're ready to give it. The combination to Locker 7 is your birthday month, day, year. Inside is the Emergency Atmospheric Navigation System, the bridge technology. I mentioned to Sarah Park before she disappeared. It's designed to operate in electromagnetic collapse zones where standard avionics fail. I never tested it. The FAA would never certify it. No insurance company would cover it. It violates a dozen regulations and probably a few laws of physics. But it works, at least in theory. Victor and I designed it together in 1995 before our partnership collapsed. It represents the best of what we could have accomplished if we'd trusted each other more and our own egos less. Use it to bring Sarah home. Use the data to expose what the airlines have been hiding. Use everything I built to finish what we started. And David, forgive yourself for Sarah. Her death wasn't your fault. The medical system failed you both. But you're not broken, son. You're just bent. And bent, things can be hammered straight. Love, Grandpa. P.S. The analog system requires a pilot who understands both old and new technology. Someone who can think like a 1960s test pilot while flying a modern jet. I can only think of one person qualified. You. David read the letter 3 times before he could breathe properly. Then he spun the combination lock, 10-2381, and opened the locker. Inside was something that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd seen the future and decided to build it using 1970s technology. Modular avionics packages entirely analog with specifications written in his grandfather's precise engineering script. Emergency Atmospheric Navigation System Prototype 3. David read aloud. Tested to 65,000 feet in simulation. Never flight tested, never certified, never safe. But it should work. Should, Elena repeated. That's reassuring. My grandfather didn't deal in certainties. David pulled out the main unit, examining the craftsmanship. He dealt in carefully calculated maybes. His phone buzzed, a text from Tom. Those lawyers are back. Brought the county sheriff. They're serving papers. How long do we have? Elena asked. David looked at his phone's clock. Before they shut us down completely, maybe 12 hours. Before they get a court order to seize the facility, 24. And Sarah has 48 hours of beacon life left. They looked at each other across the underground facility, across decades of buried research and hidden warnings across the gap between what needed to be done and what was legally possible. We can't retrofit the Gulfstream in 12 hours, David said. Even working non-stop, it's a 30-hour job minimum. Then we work non-stop and hope we're faster than we think. Elena was already heading for the stairs. I'll start prepping the aircraft. You grab whatever tools we need. Tom can run interference with the lawyers. Elena! David caught her arm. Even if we get the system installed, even if it works, flying into a collapse zone is a suicide mission. The atmospheric conditions that killed Sarah's avionics will do the same to us. We'll be flying blind through electromagnetic storms that could rip the aircraft apart. I know. And if we survive the rescue, we'll be arrested the moment we land. Your board will press charges for theft, unauthorized use of company property, probably a dozen aviation violations. We could spend years in federal prison. I know that too. Elena pulled her arm free, but gently. But Sarah Park has been alone in that zone for 3 weeks, David. 3 weeks thinking nobody's coming. 3 weeks wondering if she matters enough to save. And I'm not going to let her die wondering. She started up the stairs, then paused and looked back. Your grandfather wrote in his notes that sometimes doing the right thing costs everything. That's how you know it's right. She smiled without humor. He also wrote that the best partnerships are forged in impossible circumstances. Let's find out if he was right about that too. David watched her climb back into the daylight, then looked around the facility one more time. His grandfather's life work hidden and waiting, built on the faith that someday someone would be crazy enough to use it. Guess I'm that crazy, he muttered to the empty room. He gathered the analog system components, the documentation, and his grandfather's final notebook. As he climbed the stairs, he noticed something carved into the wall near the top. His grandfather's handwriting scratched into concrete. Fear is temporary. Regret is forever. Thanks, Grandpa, David said to the darkness below. No pressure or anything. Tom was waiting at the top with a status report and 3 federal marshals serving papers. Mr. Chen, the lead marshal said, I have a temporary restraining order preventing any modification or movement of the aircraft currently on your runway. Violation of this order will result in immediate arrest. David looked at the papers at Elena already circling the Gulf Stream with a toolbox at Tom's worried expression. Marshal, I need to ask you something. You ex-military... The man blinked. Marine Corps. 20 years. Why? Because I need you to understand what I'm about to say as one veteran to another, even though I was Air Force, and you probably think we're all soft. David handed the papers back. A scientist named Sarah Park has been trapped in a survival situation for 3 weeks because the company that employed her decided rescue was too expensive and too embarrassing. In 48 hours, she dies. I'm going to prevent that, and I don't care what papers you're holding. The marshal looked at the TRO, then at David, then at his 2 companions. Dave, Mike, go wait in the car. After the other marshals left, the man stepped closer, lowering his voice. I'm legally obligated to enforce this order. I understand. I'm also legally obligated to witness any violations and report them. I understand that too. The marshal folded the papers and tucked them into his jacket. My shift ends at 6 p.m. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 a.m. to check compliance. What happens between 6 p.m. today and 8 a.m. tomorrow? He shrugged. I couldn't possibly witness, could I? He walked back to his car, then paused and called back. Bring her home, son, and try not to die doing it. The paperwork's a bitch. After they drove away, Tom let out a breath he'd been holding. We just got a 12-hour window, he said. 14, David corrected. And we're going to need every minute. Elena had already opened the Gulfstream's engine cowlings and was photographing the damage with her tablet, taking measurements, muttering calculations. Starboard engines shot, she called down. We'll need to bypass it completely. Route all power through the port engine and the APU. David, your analog system, can it run on reduced power? It's designed to operate on emergency battery if needed. David climbed up to join her. But we'll have no redundancy. If anything fails, we fall out of the sky. Then we don't let anything fail. She pulled out a schematic on her tablet. I'm sending you the Gulfstream's electrical architecture. Show me where we integrate your grandfather's system. For the next 4 hours, they worked in silence, broken only by technical discussion and the occasional curse when something didn't fit or couldn't be modified as planned. Tom brought coffee and food that nobody ate and kept watch for returning lawyers or marshals or anyone else who might complicate their already complicated situation. At hour 6, David's hands started shaking from exhaustion and caffeine and the weight of what they were attempting. He was installing the analog navigation system's primary processor when he realized his vision was blurring. Take a break, Elena said. She was wedged into the avionics bay covered in hydraulic fluid and sweat rewiring the flight control system. You're no good to Sarah if you pass out and crack your skull. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're running on grief and adrenaline. She extracted herself from the tight space with the grace of someone who'd spent years working on aircraft. I need you functional for the actual flight, which means you need to rest. We don't have time. David. She grabbed his shoulders, her grip firm. Listen to me. Your grandfather's notes say the collapse zone navigation requires absolute precision. If we're off by even a degree at those altitudes, we'll miss Sarah's position by miles. You need to be sharp. And you don't? I slept on the flight before I crashed here. She smiled grimly. 4 hours of meditation and rest while the autopilot flew me into position. I knew I'd need to be functional for this part. You planned everything. I had 3 weeks to plan while my board pretended Sarah didn't exist. Elena's smile faded. 3 weeks to study your grandfather's research to modify the Gulf Stream, to orchestrate a crash that looked accidental enough to avoid criminal charges, but dramatic enough to get your attention. 3 weeks to become someone I don't entirely recognize anymore. Who's that? Someone willing to destroy everything to save one person. She let go of his shoulders. Your grandfather wrote about you, you know. In his later journals. He said you were the best mechanic he'd ever trained, but that you'd lost your faith after your wife died. He worried you'd settled for fixing crop dusters when you could be building the future. David felt something hot behind his eyes. He never said any of that to me. Because he knew you weren't ready to hear it. Elena pulled out her tablet and showed him a scanned page from his grandfather's journal. But he believed someday you would be. He believed right up until the end. The journal entry was dated 2 days before James Chen died. David came by today, brought me coffee, and sat with me for an hour without saying much. Just sat. That's how I know he's healing. He can sit with silence again. I won't live to see him become who he's meant to be. But I'll die knowing I gave him the tools. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that has to be enough. David read it twice, then handed the tablet back, not trusting his voice. Rest, Elena said again. 2 hours. I'll keep working, then we'll finish this together. He wanted to argue, but exhaustion was making his bones feel hollow. He climbed down from the aircraft and found a spot against the hangar wall where he could see both the jet and the facility entrance. He set an alarm for 2 hours, closed his eyes, and fell into darkness so complete it felt like falling into his grandfather's underground facility. Except this time, he wasn't afraid of what he'd find at the bottom. He dreamed of Sarah Park, though he'd never seen her face. In the dream, she was sitting in a dead aircraft at 60,000 feet, looking out the window at stars that were too bright and too close, waiting for rescue that logic said would never come, but hope insisted might. In the dream, she was humming something, a song David's wife used to sing when she was scared during her final hospital stays. Somewhere over the rainbow, off-key and fragile and determined. He woke with tears on his face and Elena shaking his shoulder. 2 hours, she said quietly. And David? I'm sorry. About your wife. Your grandfather's journals mentioned her. She sounded remarkable. She was. David stood wiping his face. She believed I could do anything. Even after the doctors told us there was nothing left to try, she kept believing I'd find an answer. He looked at the Gulf Stream. I failed her. I'm not failing Sarah. Then let's get back to work. The final 8 hours blurred into a continuous present tense where time lost meaning, and the only reality was the next connection, the next calibration, the next test. They worked in synchronized silence, two people who'd known each other less than a day moving like partners who'd worked together for years. At hour 13, Tom brought news that the lawyers had gotten an emergency court hearing scheduled for 8 a.m. At hour 14, the marshal texted Tom running late. Won't be there until 9. Flat tire. Funny how that happens. At hour 15, David finished the final connection in the analog navigation system and ran the diagnostic sequence. Every indicator showed green except one. The primary processor's power draw was 5% higher than specifications. That'll drain the battery faster, Elena said, reading over his shoulder. We'll have maybe 4 hours of operation instead of 6. 4 hours to find Sarah, extract her, and get clear of the collapse zone. Assuming everything else works perfectly. Assuming everything works at all. They looked at each other. Two people who'd bet everything on calculations and faith and a dead man's prototype. "I need to ask you something," David said. "Why Sarah? Why risk your company, your freedom, your life for one person?" Elena was quiet for a long moment. "Because 5 years ago, Sarah Park called me at 2 a.m. because she discovered something in atmospheric data that she thought I needed to see immediately. She didn't care that I was the CEO's daughter. She didn't care about politics or chain of command. She just cared about being right." Elena smiled at the memory. "She showed me proof that my father's research methods were flawed, but that his core theory was correct. She helped me redesign the entire program. And when my father died, and the board wanted to shut everything down, Sarah stood with me in that boardroom and told them they were cowards." She looked at David. "So yeah, I'm risking everything for one person, because that one person was willing to risk everything to tell me the truth. Seems like a fair trade." David thought about his grandfather, about Sarah, his wife, about all the people who'd believed in him when he'd stopped believing in himself. "Yeah," he said, "it does." At hour 16, they completed the final system integration. At hour 17, they ran full diagnostics. At hour 18, Elena filed a flight plan that listed their destination as Atmospheric Research Zone Classified Coordinates. The tower controller, a woman who'd worked at Clearwater for 30 years, called Tom directly. "Tell David that flight plan's gonna get him arrested." "He knows," Tom replied. "Tell him I didn't see it in the system. Tell him I was on break when it came through." "Will do." At 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the marshal's shift would begin, David and Elena climbed into the Gulfstream's cockpit. The pre-flight checks took 8 minutes. The startup sequence took 3. At 5:58 a.m., they began taxiing to the runway. Tom's voice came over the radio. "Clearwater traffic, you're clear for departure. Winds calm, visibility unlimited." A pause. "Bring her home, you two, and come back safe." "Copy that, Clearwater," Elena replied. "See you in a few hours." At exactly 6:00 a.m., as the marshal's car pulled into the airport entrance, the Gulfstream rotated off runway 31 and climbed into a sky that looked deceptively peaceful. David engaged the analog navigation system. The old vacuum tubes warmed up glowing amber in the dim cockpit, overlaying modern digital displays with technology that belonged in a museum but might be the only thing that kept them alive. "Collapse zone boundary in 90 minutes, Elena said, reading from the navigation display. "Sarah's last known position in 120. Battery life, 3 hours 52 minutes at current draw. So we have approximately 8 minutes of margin for error. Approximately none if anything goes wrong." David looked at the brightening sky ahead, at the instruments showing perfect flying conditions, at the data predicting they were about to fly into hell. "My grandfather used to say that faith isn't believing everything will work out. It's doing the right thing even when you know it might not." Elena smiled. "Sarah says something similar. She says hope is the decision to keep trying after logic says quit." "Smart woman." "The smartest." Elena's hands were steady on the controls. "Let's go prove her right." The Gulfstream climbed through 30,000 feet, 40,000, 50,000, pushing toward altitudes where the air got thin and the sky turned dark and commercial aviation ended and something else began. Behind them, the sun rose over Clearwater Regional Airport, painting the runway gold. Ahead, the collapse zone waited like a mouth in the sky, ready to swallow them whole or spit them back out, and there was no way to know which until they were already too deep to turn back. The first indication something was wrong came at 58,000 feet, when the primary navigation system flickered and died without warning. "That's normal," Elena said, her voice tight. "We're hitting the collapse zone boundary. Your grandfather's system should compensate in 3-2. The analog navigation came alive, vacuum tubes, glowing brighter. Old mechanical gyroscopes, spinning up with a sound like distant thunder. The modern glass displays went dark, replaced by analog gauges that belonged in a museum, and suddenly they were flying a $78 million jet, using technology from the Vietnam War. Compensating. David said, his hands finding the manual trim controls. The fly-by-wire system was gone, replaced by direct cable linkages his grandfather had somehow integrated into a computer-controlled aircraft. Jesus, this is like flying a freight train with a piece of string. Can you handle it? Ask me in 5 minutes. The Gulfstream shuddered as they pushed deeper into the zone. Outside the cockpit windows, the sky was doing things sky shouldn't do. Colors shifting through spectrums that didn't belong in nature, the air itself seeming to ripple like water disturbed by something massive moving beneath the surface. Electromagnetic interference increasing. Elena read from one of the few digital displays still functioning. We're at 400% normal background radiation, 800, 1200. The radio exploded with static so loud, David's ears rang. He ripped off his headset just as every remaining digital system went dark. The only light in the cockpit came from his grandfather's analog instruments glowing amber and steady, while everything modern died around them. We're blind, Elena said. She'd torn off her headset too. No radio, no radar, no collision avoidance. If there's any other traffic up here, there's not. Nobody's crazy enough to fly in this except us. And Sarah? And Sarah, David agreed. The turbulence hit like a fist. The Gulfstream dropped 300 feet in 2 seconds, then shot up 400, then rolled 30 degrees left before David could correct. His grandfather's analog instruments never wavered, the old gyroscopes and accelerometers tracking their position with mechanical precision, while the dead computers around them proved why modern aviation couldn't survive up here. How long until we reach Sarah's coordinates? David asked, fighting the controls. Sweat was running down his back, despite the cockpit's freezing temperature. At this altitude, they were above most of the atmosphere, and the environmental system was struggling to compensate. Elena had pulled out a paper chart, actual paper because nothing digital worked, and was calculating their position using the analog instruments and her watch. 22 minutes at current speed, but David looked at the battery. He glanced at the power gauge. 3 hours and 14 minutes remaining, and they'd only been flying for 38 minutes. We're draining faster than predicted. A lot faster. The electromagnetic interference is causing the system to work harder, drawing more power to maintain stability. Elena's voice stayed level, but David could hear the fear underneath. At this rate, we'll have maybe 40 minutes inside the zone before we lose power completely. How long to find Sarah, extract her, and get clear? Optimistically, 50 minutes. They looked at each other across the darkened cockpit, lit only by amber instrument glow and the alien colors of the sky outside. So we're not getting out, David said. Not unless we find her in the next 10 minutes and she's ready to go immediately. And if we don't, Elena's jaw tightened. Then we die up here with her. At least she won't be alone. David thought about his grandfather, about the prototype system that was keeping them alive, but slowly running out of juice about all the calculations and careful planning that hadn't accounted for the zone being worse than predicted. My grandfather wrote that sometimes doing the right thing costs everything. But he also wrote that bent things can be hammered straight, Elena replied. So let's find that extra 10 minutes. What systems can we shut down? They spent the next 3 minutes going through every electrical system on the aircraft, shutting down everything non-essential. Environmental controls went to minimum. Cabin pressurization dropped to barely survivable levels. David's ears popped painfully as the pressure changed, and his breath started fogging in the suddenly frigid air. That bought us maybe 8 minutes, Elena said through chattering teeth. She'd started shivering despite her jacket. Not enough. Then we fly faster. We're already at max cruise for this altitude. David pushed the throttles forward. The remaining engine screamed in protest, running beyond its design limits, but their airspeed increased. The Gulfstream shook harder, the turbulence amplified by their speed, but the analog navigation system tracked their course with mechanical indifference to comfort or safety. 15 minutes to Sarah's position, Elena calculated, At this power draw, we'll have maybe 25 minutes of battery when we get there. Enough time to find her and get out if everything goes perfectly. Everything never goes perfectly. Then we'll make it go perfectly. The turbulence got worse. The Gulf Stream was being thrown around like a toy in the hands of an angry god, dropping and rising and rolling with forces that should have torn the aircraft apart. David's arms were screaming from fighting the controls, and he could see Elena's knuckles white on her armrests, trusting him to keep them alive while she navigated using instruments that predated pocket calculators. 10 minutes out, she said. Battery at 42 minutes remaining. David, even if we find her immediately, we'll make it work. You keep saying that. Because the alternative is admitting we're going to die, and I'm not ready to do that yet. Elena laughed high and sharp. You know what Sarah told me before this flight? She said, if I don't come back, make sure they know it was worth it. Make sure they know the data matters more than my life. Sounds like she doesn't know you very well. She knows me perfectly. That's why she said it. Elena checked her chart again. 5 minutes. I'm going to try to raise her on emergency frequency. The radio's dead, but maybe if we get close enough. She pulled out a handheld aviation radio battery-powered designed for ground use, but they were out of options. She keyed the transmit button. Sarah Park, this is Elena Volkov on emergency frequency 121.5. How do you copy? Static. Then so faint, David almost missed it a voice. Elena. Elena's face transformed fear, replaced by something fierce and desperate. Sarah, we're inbound to your position, ETA 4 minutes. What's your status? Aircraft's intact, but completely dead. No power, no heat running on emergency oxygen. Elena, you shouldn't be here. The zone's gotten worse. We noticed. Can you see us? Negative. Visibility's maybe 100 feet. It's like flying through a storm made of, I don't even know what, colors that shouldn't exist. We're using analog navigation. Your last known coordinates put you at, Elena read off numbers. That's about right, but Elena, I'm drifting. The winds up here are insane. I could be miles from where you think I am. David's stomach sank. Finding a powerless aircraft in electromagnetic soup with 100-foot visibility would be like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach while blindfolded. We'll find you, Elena said. Keep talking. We'll home in on your radio signal. My radio's almost dead. Battery's been running for 3 weeks. I've got maybe 5 minutes of transmit time left. Then talk for 5 minutes. Tell me about the data. Tell me what you found that was worth dying for. There was a pause. Then Sarah's voice came back stronger. The collapse zones aren't natural, Elena. They're not even really caused by aviation, not directly. We're detecting quantum-level disruptions in the upper atmosphere, like reality's fabric is tearing at the seams. Every high-altitude flight, every satellite launch, every rocket we push through these layers, we're not just depleting the ozone or warming the climate. We're breaking something fundamental about how the atmosphere holds together. Jesus, David muttered. The data shows it started small in the 40s when we began regular high-altitude flight. By the 70s, the tiers were healing slower. Now they're not healing at all. They're growing, merging, creating zones where normal physics stops working reliably. And David... Sarah must have heard his voice in the background. Your grandfather figured this out in the 80s. He tried to warn everyone. He was right about everything. David's throat was tight. Did he know how to fix it? He had theories. Something about using resonance to reinforce the atmospheric layers instead of tearing them. But he died before he could test it. Sarah's voice was getting weaker. Elena, my battery's dying. I need you to promise me something. Anything. If you can't find me, if this rescue fails, promise you'll get the data out. Promise you'll make them listen. You're aboard the FAA, the airlines, everyone. Because in maybe 10 years, we're looking at a complete collapse of high-altitude aviation. Commercial flights will be grounded. The global economy will... Her transmission cut off mid-sentence. Sarah. Elena was shouting into the radio. "Sarah, do you copy? Nothing but static. 2 minutes to her coordinates," David said. He was scanning the sky outside, but visibility was exactly as bad as Sarah had described, maybe 100 feet of twisted colors, and then nothing. Finding another aircraft in this would be impossible, unless... "Elena, your tablet, is the camera still working?" "Maybe the electronics are fried, but the camera's pretty basic." She pulled it out. The screen was dead, but when she pressed the power button, it flickered to life, showing just the camera viewfinder and nothing else. "Get to the cabin. Start recording in all directions. If we pass close to Sarah's aircraft, even for a second, we might catch it on camera." Elena was already moving, climbing out of her seat and heading back into the cabin. David heard her opening windows. The Gulfstream had small emergency windows that could be opened even in flight for emergency ventilation. Freezing air howled into the cabin, but it gave Elena clear views in multiple directions. "Recording," she called forward. "Flying grid search pattern. No time. We're going to fly straight through her projected position and hope she's close enough to spot." David checked the battery gauge. 31 minutes remaining. "If we don't see her on the first pass, we're out of time." He adjusted course based on Elena's calculations, aiming for where Sarah should be if she'd drifted at expected wind speeds. The analog navigation system tracked their path with mechanical precision, but there was no way to know if Sarah had drifted faster or slower or in a completely different direction. 60 seconds to her position," David called back. Elena didn't answer. She was focused on the tablet, recording through multiple windows, trying to capture every angle as they flew through the impossible sky. 30 seconds. David's eyes were scanning constantly, looking for any sign of another aircraft. A glint of metal, a shadow against the colored air, anything. 15 seconds. "Batteries at 28 minutes, he called back. They'd pushed past the point of no return. Even if they turned around right now, they wouldn't make it out of the zone before power failed. 5 seconds. David saw nothing, just the twisted colors and the darkness of near space above, and the violent air currents that were slowly tearing the Gulfstream apart, despite his grandfather's analog system holding them stable. "Mark," he called. They'd passed through Sarah's coordinates. "I didn't see anything," Elena shouted back. "David, we need to wait. Wait, there's something on the camera. When I panned left about 10 seconds ago..." She was running back to the cockpit, tablet in hand. The screen showed a still frame from the recording, enhanced as much as the dying electronics could manage. And there, barely visible against the chaos of the sky, was a dark shape that could have been an aircraft, or could have been a shadow, or could have been wishful thinking. "That's her," Elena said with absolute certainty. "That's Sarah's aircraft. She's drifted west of her coordinates, maybe 2 miles. Batteries at 26 minutes. If we divert to search, we're already dead if we don't find her. Divert." David banked the Gulfstream hard left, the analog instruments tracking their new course. 2 miles at their current speed would take 90 seconds, and they'd already used 30 seconds discussing it, which left 60 seconds to spot an aircraft in conditions where visibility was measured in hope and desperation. There, Elena was pointing through the windscreen. 2 o'clock, same altitude. David saw it, a shape in the chaos darker than the surrounding air, the distinctive profile of a research aircraft that had been Sarah's mobile laboratory for 3 weeks while she waited to die or be rescued. "How do we extract her?" David asked. "We can't dock with her aircraft. We can't land up here, and she has no power to maneuver." Elena was already pulling out her phone. The screen was cracked but still functioning. She'd loaded contingency plans before they left, because of course she had. "High-altitude extraction. Military uses it for downed pilots in hostile territory." She was reading fast. "We match altitude and speed. Maintain position alongside her aircraft. She opens her emergency exit and crosses over using a safety line." "That's insane. You have a better idea." David didn't. He maneuvered the Gulfstream closer to Sarah's aircraft, fighting the turbulence that wanted to throw them into each other, At this altitude, with this visibility formation flying, was impossible. But his grandfather had spent 25 years preparing him for impossible, and David's hands found the controls with a precision that came from decades of practice and desperation. 50 feet. Elena called out, watching their separation. 40 feet. 30. That's close enough or we'll collision. David was sweating despite the freezing air. Get the door open. Tell Sarah to get ready. Elena ran back to the cabin door, the same door she'd blown open during her controlled crash landing what felt like years ago, but had been less than 24 hours. She got it open, wind screaming through the gap, the emergency oxygen masks deploying automatically. She grabbed one of the masks and keyed the handheld radio one more time. Sarah, we're alongside you. Can you see us? A long pause. Then, I see you. Elena, this is crazy. I know. Open your emergency exit. We're going to throw you a line. I don't have a safety harness. Then hold on tight. David maintained their position, his eyes locked on Sarah's aircraft, his hands making constant micro-adjustments to keep them parallel. The battery gauge showed 19 minutes remaining. They needed to complete the extraction and start running for the zone boundary in the next 5 minutes, or they'd never make it out. Elena had found an emergency rappelling line in the Gulfstream's safety kit, because apparently Billionaire's prepared for everything and was securing one end to the aircraft's internal structure. She clipped the other end to a carabiner and prepared to throw it across the gap. Sarah, exit opening in 3, 2, 1. Through the chaos, David saw Sarah's emergency door pop open. A figure appeared in the opening, small and dark against the impossible skyface, obscured by an oxygen mask body, wrapped in what looked like every piece of clothing she owned. Elena threw the line. The wind caught it, whipping it away, and it missed Sarah's aircraft completely. Damn it! Elena was already pulling the line back, preparing to throw again. David, can you get us closer? Not without colliding. Then I need a better throw. She hauled the line in, coiled it carefully despite the wind trying to rip it from her hands, and prepared for a second attempt. Sarah, ready? Sarah was braced in her doorway, one hand gripping the frame, the other reaching out. She looked like she'd lost 20 pounds. Her face gaunt, her movements weak from weeks of survival on emergency rations and hope. Elena threw again. This time the line sailed straight, and Sarah caught it on the second grab. She secured it around her body with knots that suggested she'd practiced this in her mind 1,000 times over 3 weeks of waiting. I'm coming across. Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. Elena, if I fall, tell my mother I wasn't scared at the end. You're not going to fall, and you're going to tell her yourself. Sarah stepped out of her aircraft into 60,000 feet of nothing but twisted air and death. The line went taut, and Elena was pulling hand over hand, dragging Sarah across the 40-foot gap that might as well have been a mile. David fought to keep the aircraft stable. Every instinct screamed to watch Sarah's crossing, but his eyes stayed locked on the instruments on the analog gauges that were the only thing keeping them alive on the battery, reading that now showed 16 minutes. Halfway. Elena grunted. Sarah was suspended in the gap between aircraft spinning slowly, the wind trying to rip her away or dash her against metal. Turbulence ahead, David called. He could see the air rippling more violently in front of them. 30 seconds. Almost there, Elena said. She was hauling faster now, her arms shaking with effort. Sarah, reach for the door. Sarah's hand shot out, grabbing the doorframe. Elena caught her wrist, pulled hard, and suddenly Sarah was tumbling into the cabin, both women collapsing in a heap as the line went slack. Close the door, David shouted. The turbulence hit like a bomb going off. The Gulfstream rolled 40 degrees right, then pitched up violently. David fought the controls, his grandfather's analog system keeping them flying when anything computerized would have given up and sent them into an uncontrollable spin. Elena slammed the door shut and dogged it closed. The wind noise cut off, replaced by the sounds of two women gasping for breath and laughing and maybe crying. "Batteries at 14 minutes, David called back. "We need to go now." Elena appeared in the cockpit entrance, supporting Sarah. The scientist looked like a ghost, pale, shaking, barely able to stand. But her eyes were sharp and alert and burning with the intensity of someone who'd survived the impossible. "Thank you," Sarah said. Her voice was hoarse from weeks of minimal conversation. "Thank you for being crazy enough to come." "Thank David," Elena said, "and his grandfather. Without the analog system. James Chen." Sarah's face changed, understanding flooding in. "You're David Chen, James's grandson. I tried to tell Elena your grandfather's research was the key to everything. He understood." "Save the science discussion," David interrupted. "Collapse zone boundary is 38 minutes of flying at max speed. We have 14 minutes of battery. Someone want to tell me how that math works?" They looked at each other. David, Elena, and Sarah, three people who'd bet everything on a rescue that had succeeded but left them trapped, just as certainly as if they'd failed. "We drop," Sarah said finally. "Kill the analog system, let the aircraft fall out of the collapse zone on minimal power restart systems when we're back in normal atmosphere." "That's a controlled crash from 60,000 feet, Elena said. "Unless you have a better idea?" Nobody did. David checked their position. They were as close to the zone boundary as they could get before the battery died. Beyond that boundary, normal aviation rules would apply, which meant their dead aircraft would become a gliding tombstone unless they could restart systems in time. "Everyone strap in," David said. "And Sarah, if we survive this, you're explaining to me exactly what my grandfather knew and why it got him killed." "He wasn't killed," Sarah said quietly, buckling into the co-pilot's seat. "He died of cancer. But I think the stress of knowing and not being believed, I think that killed him long before the cancer did." "Strap in," David repeated. "We're going to fall out of the sky now." He disabled the analog navigation system. Immediately, every instrument went dark as the battery gave its last gasp of power. The Gulfstream became a $78 million glider at 60,000 feet, with no power and no computer control and nothing but physics and prayer keeping them from disintegrating. They fell. The sensation was like falling in a dream, except the part where it was absolutely real and absolutely terrifying. The Gulfstream dropped through the collapse zone boundary, air pressure increasing, temperature changing, electromagnetic interference fading as they descended through layers of atmosphere that should have been stable, but were slowly tearing apart. At 40,000 feet, David tried to restart the emergency power. Nothing happened. The battery was completely drained. At 30,000 feet, Elena tried manually deploying the Ram air turbine, a small emergency generator that dropped into the airstream and used wind power to generate electricity. The lever moved, something mechanical engaged, but no lights came on. At 20,000 feet, Sarah said what they were all thinking: "We're going to crash." At 15,000 feet, something miraculous happened. The Ram air turbine caught properly, started spinning, and began generating power. The modern glass displays flickered to life. The fly-by-wire system rebooted, and David suddenly had control of an aircraft that had been a falling brick seconds before. He pulled back on the stick. The Gulfstream responded sluggishly, its system still warming up, but it responded. They were still descending fast, but now it was controlled descent instead of freefall. At 10,000 feet, Elena's phone started working again. It immediately exploded with notifications, dozens of missed calls, hundreds of texts, all of them from the same sources: lawyers, federal marshals, the FAA, and Volkov Industries Board of Directors. "We're going to be arrested the second we land," she said, reading through the messages. "Probably," David agreed. He was focused on flying, on coaxing their damaged aircraft towards something resembling a safe landing. "But we'll be arrested alive with Sarah, which beats the alternative." At 5,000 feet, the radio came back online. Tom's voice burst through, frantic and relieved. "Clear water traffic. Unknown aircraft, identify yourself immediately." Tom, it's David. We're coming home. David. Tom's voice cracked. Jesus Christ, son. Do you have any idea the FAA's got fighters scrambled? They think you stole that jet? We did steal it, but we're bringing it back. And Tom, yeah, we got her. We got Sarah. A long pause. Then, clear to land runway 31, winds calm, emergency services standing by. And David, there's about 50 federal agents waiting to arrest you. Figured, David said. See you in a minute. He lined up for the runway, the Gulfstream handling badly, with one engine destroyed and systems running on emergency power. But they were alive and descending, and Clearwater Regional Airport was coming into view. Sarah was crying quietly in the co-pilot seat. Elena was gripping the armrests, her face composed, but her eyes showing everything she wasn't saying. Your grandfather would be proud, Sarah said softly. He designed that analog system knowing someone would need it someday, knowing it might save a life. He was right. He was right about a lot of things, David replied. The runway rose up to meet them. David fought the damaged aircraft down, touched down harder than he'd like, but safely, and rolled to a stop in almost the exact same spot where Elena had crashed 24 hours earlier. Through the windscreen, he could see them waiting: federal marshals, FAA investigators, armed agents, and in the middle of it all, Margaret Vance, with a smile that promised consequences. Well, Elena said, unbuckling her seatbelt. Ready to face the music. David thought about his grandfather, about the 25 years of hidden work, about the analog system that had saved 3 lives and proven everything James Chen had died trying to tell the world. Yeah, he said. Let's go show them what we found. They opened the door together, David, Elena, and Sarah, and stepped out into a morning that looked completely normal, except for the part where they were about to be arrested for saving a life and exposing a conspiracy and proving that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing weren't even close to the same. Margaret Vance stepped forward, flanked by marshals. Ms. Volkov, Mr. Chen, you're both under arrest for theft of corporate property, violation of federal aviation regulations, and about 15 other charges we're still finalizing. I'm sure you are, Elena said calmly. But before you arrest us, you should probably know that Dr. Park's been recording everything for the past 3 weeks. Every reading from inside the collapse zone, every failure of standard avionics, every piece of evidence proving that Volkov Industries and every major airline have been knowingly ignoring data that puts millions of passengers at risk. She pulled out Sarah's tablet. Somehow Sarah had managed to bring it during the extraction and held it up. 3 weeks of continuous data collection, 25 years of atmospheric research from James Chen's facility, and the testimony of 3 people who just proved that the collapse zones are real, growing, and going to end commercial aviation as we know it unless someone does something. Vance's smile never wavered, but her eyes went cold. That data belongs to Volkov Industries. Accessing it without authorization is corporate espionage. Actually, Sarah interrupted, her voice hoarse but steady. That data belongs to me. My personal research conducted on my own time, stored on my personal devices, and I'm releasing it to the public right now. She held up her phone, battered, covered in frost, but functional. Her thumb hovered over the send button. Unless you'd prefer to have a conversation about how Volkov Industries' board of directors deliberately delayed rescue operations because they were worried about stock prices and legal liability. The standoff stretched out, federal agents watching, marshals waiting for orders. David and Elena and Sarah standing together against an entire corrupt system. Then Tom's voice cut through the tension. Might want to look at that before you arrest anyone, Margaret. He was pointing at his computer screen visible through the tower windows. On it was a news alert just breaking. Atmospheric scientist rescued from collapse zone, survivor claims commercial aviation faces extinction event. Someone had leaked the story. Probably Tom. Possibly half the airport staff who'd been listening on radio frequencies. And now the whole world was watching. Vance looked at the news alert at the cameras from local stations, already pulling into the airport, at the phone in Sarah's hand, still hovering over the send button. "You're still under arrest," she said finally. "All of you. But the charges," she glanced at the lawyers flanking her, "might be negotiable, depending on how this plays out." "Sounds like a conversation for later," Elena said. "Right now, I think Dr. Park needs medical attention, and David and I need to make sure his grandfather's research gets to people who'll actually use it instead of burying it." The marshals moved forward to take them into custody, but gently now, professionally, rather than aggressively. As they led David past the Gulf Stream, he looked up at the aircraft that had saved 3 lives using technology from a dead man and faith from people who'd refused to quit. His grandfather's voice whispered one last time, "Sometimes the right choice is the one that scares you most. But you made it anyway, son. You made it anyway." Yeah, David thought, letting the marshals guide him toward their vehicle. He had. And whatever came next, arrests, trials, testimony, consequences, at least he'd done it for something that mattered. The federal holding facility smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams, and David had been staring at the same water-stained ceiling tile for 6 hours when the door finally opened. Not a marshal. Not a lawyer. Margaret Vance. She sat down across from him in the interrogation room, setting a tablet on the table between them. Her steel gray suit was immaculate despite the late hour, her expression unreadable. "You've created quite a problem, Mr. Chen." "Good," David said. His wrists ached from the handcuffs they'd removed an hour ago, and his body felt like it had been run through a wood chipper, but his voice was steady. "That was sort of this point." Vance smiled thinly. "Dr. Park's data went viral 4 hours ago. Every major news network, every aviation blog, every conspiracy theorist with a podcast, everyone's talking about collapse zones and atmospheric degradation and how commercial aviation is doomed. Our stock dropped 19% in the last trading hour alone." Again, good. "The FAA has launched an immediate investigation. The NTSB wants testimony. Congress is scheduling emergency hearings, and," she leaned forward, "3 major airlines have already filed lawsuits claiming Volkov Industries knowingly concealed safety data that should have been reported years ago." "Sounds like you've got a busy week ahead." "We do. Which is why I'm here to make you an offer." Vance turned the tablet around, showing him a document. "The board of directors is prepared to drop all charges against you, Elena and Dr. Park. You'll walk out of here tonight free and clear." David didn't touch the tablet. "What's the catch?" "You sign a non-disclosure agreement. You never discuss the collapse zones publicly. You turn over all of James Chen's research to Volkov Industries, and you sell us Clearwater Airport for the original $8 million offer. So we save Sarah expose the truth and then immediately help you bury it again." David laughed, no humor in it. "That's some offer." "It's the smart offer." Vance's voice went hard. "Mr. Chen, do you have any idea what you've unleashed? The global aviation industry generates $8 trillion annually. It employs 10 million people. It's the backbone of international commerce, tourism, and emergency response. And you've just told the world it's all going to collapse in a decade. Because it is. Maybe. But there's a difference between a problem we can solve quietly over 10 years and a panic that crashes the entire industry tomorrow." She pulled up a news clip on the tablet, people storming airports, flights being canceled, passengers demanding refunds. This is happening right now. Hundreds of thousands of people stranded because they're terrified to fly. Airlines losing billions. The economic cascade could trigger a recession. That's not my fault. That's yours. You people knew about this for years and did nothing. We were working on solutions. You were protecting stock prices. David stood, walked to the small window, looked out at the parking lot where media vans were gathered like vultures. "My grandfather spent 25 years trying to warn people. He died knowing he'd failed. Well, I'm not failing. Whatever consequences come from telling the truth, that's on you for hiding it so long." Vance was quiet for a moment. Then she closed the tablet and stood. "You're an idealist, Mr. Chen. I respect that, even if I think it's naive." She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the handle. But let me tell you what's really going to happen. The FAA will investigate and find no immediate danger. The airlines will dispute Dr. Park's data. Our lawyers will tie this up in courts for years. And eventually, the news cycle will move on to the next crisis, and everyone will forget about collapse zones until the first major disaster actually happens. Then we'll keep reminding them. With what platform you're a small-town mechanic facing federal charges? Elena will be removed as a shareholder if the board has its way. And Dr. Park, Vance smiled coldly, is a scientist who violated a dozen safety protocols and nearly died because of her obsession. Who do you think the public will believe, the three of you or every major airline and aviation authority working together to calm fears and maintain order? She opened the door. Think about it, Mr. Chen. You can be a martyr who accomplished nothing, or you can take the money, keep your freedom, and let the adults handle this. You have until morning to decide. After she left, David sat alone in the interrogation room, thinking about everything his grandfather had taught him about doing the right thing, even when it cost everything. The door opened again. This time, it was Elena, escorted by a marshal, who looked uncomfortable about the whole situation. 5 minutes, the marshal said, leaving them alone. Elena looked exhausted. Her clothes were wrinkled. Her hair was coming loose from its usual tight knot, and there was a bruise on her temple where the crash had struck her. But her eyes were clear and fierce. They offered you the deal, she said. Not a question. $8 million, and our freedom in exchange for silence and complicity. David leaned back in his chair. Vance says we've started a panic that could crash the global economy. She's not wrong. Elena sat down heavily. I've been watching the news. Flight cancellations are up 400%. 2 major airlines have grounded their entire long-haul fleets pending safety reviews. The market's in freefall. You sound like you're considering taking the deal. I'm considering whether we did the right thing. Elena's voice was quiet. We saved Sarah. That was always the goal. But now, millions of people's livelihoods are at risk. The aviation industry might not recover. And for what? To expose a problem that won't actually kill anyone for another decade. It's already killing people. Sarah would have died if we hadn't. Sarah chose to fly into a collapse zone knowing the risks. She's a scientist who made a calculated decision. Elena rubbed her eyes. But all those people losing their jobs, all those families who can't afford to travel anymore, they didn't choose any of this. We forced it on them. David stared at her, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. You're actually going to take the deal. I'm actually trying to figure out if we're heroes or villains. Elena met his eyes. My father spent his whole life so obsessed with being right that he destroyed his family and died alone in a boardroom. I swore I wouldn't be like him, but here I am causing chaos because I couldn't accept that some problems don't have good solutions. So we just let them bury the truth. We let the next Sarah Park die because we were too scared of consequences. Maybe we let the aviation industry solve this problem in a way that doesn't destroy millions of lives. Elena's voice was pleading now. They have resources we don't. They can develop solutions, retrofit aircraft transitions safely over time. They've had 25 years to do that. They did nothing. Because they didn't believe it was urgent. Now they do. Maybe that's enough. The door opened. The marshal was back, but he wasn't alone. Sarah Park walked in. Moving slowly but under her own power. Her face still gaunt, but her eyes burning with the same intensity David remembered from the rescue. Sorry, Sarah said to the marshal. I know I'm supposed to be in medical observation, but I heard you were having a meeting without me, and that seemed rude. The marshal sighed. 5 minutes, all of you. Then I'm getting written up for this. After he left, Sarah pulled up a chair and sat between David and Elena. So, she said, we're discussing whether to take Vance's deal and bury everything we just risked our lives to expose. Did I get that right? It's more complicated than, Elena started. It's exactly that simple. Sarah's voice was hoarse but firm. And before you decide, let me tell you what I was doing for 3 weeks alone at 60,000 feet. I was running calculations, not just about atmospheric degradation, but about what happens if we don't fix this. She pulled out her phone, somehow still functional, and showed them a spreadsheet. Collapse zones are growing at an exponential rate. By 2030, high-altitude flight over the Pacific will be impossible without atmospheric shielding technology that doesn't exist. By 2032, the Atlantic routes start failing. By 2035, even domestic flights above 40,000 feet become unreliable. She looked between them. And when the first major disaster happens, when a passenger jet with 300 people falls out of the sky because it hit a collapse zone, nobody warned them about how many lives are on our conscience for staying quiet. That's years away, Elena said. We have time to develop solutions if we start now. We have no time at all if the industry spends the next 5 years denying the problem exists. Sarah leaned forward. Elena, I know you're scared. I know this feels like we're burning down the world, but sometimes you have to burn down the old to build something better. Easy for you to say. You don't have 10 million jobs on your conscience. No, I just had 3 weeks to imagine my mother getting a phone call saying I died alone because my employer decided I wasn't worth the bad publicity. Sarah's voice cracked. So forgive me if I don't give a damn about stock prices and quarterly earnings. People matter more than profits. And if the aviation industry can't figure out how to keep flying safely, then maybe it deserves to fail. Elena looked like she'd been slapped. She stood, abruptly walked to the window, stood with her back to them. My father used to say that, she said quietly. That people matter more than profits. Then he spent 20 years putting his research above his family, above his health, above everything. He died proving he was right, and nobody cared enough to listen. She turned around, and David saw tears on her face for the first time. I don't want to be him. I don't want to sacrifice everything for a principle, and discover it wasn't worth the cost. David stood and walked to her. Your father failed because he tried to do it alone. He didn't trust my grandfather. He didn't trust his colleagues. He just pushed harder and got more isolated until he had nothing left but his obsession. He put a hand on her shoulder. But you're not alone. You have Sarah. You have me. You have Tom and everyone at Clearwater who's been covering for us since this started. And you have your grandfather's research not as a weapon to prove you're right, but as a foundation to build something better. David's right, Sarah said, joining them. We're not trying to destroy the aviation industry. We're trying to save it. But we can only do that if people know the truth. Elena wiped her eyes, took a shaky breath. And if the truth causes chaos, then we help clean it up, David said simply. But we don't run from it. We don't hide it. We face it like adults who understand that sometimes doing the right thing means accepting consequences we can't control. The marshal opened the door. Time's up. We need you back in. He stopped staring at something behind them. They turned to see what had caught his attention through the interrogation room's window. They could see the parking lot, and what was happening there made David's breath catch. People were arriving. Not media, not lawyers. Regular people, mechanics in coveralls, pilots in uniform, flight attendants, air traffic controllers. Dozens of them, then hundreds gathering in the parking lot with signs that read, Tell the Truth, and Atmospheric Safety Now, and Thank you for saving Dr. Park. Tom was there holding a banner that said, Clearwater Airport stands with David Chen. What the hell? Elena whispered. Sarah was reading something on her phone. It's trending. #collapse zones, #atmospheric truth. Save Dr. Park. They're all trending worldwide. People are organizing rallies at airports demanding transparency, calling for congressional hearings. She looked up, eyes wide. David, you're not alone. None of us are. The marshal cleared his throat. I'm supposed to take you back to your cells, but... He gestured at the growing crowd outside. I'm thinking maybe you three should see this first. Unofficially. They walked out together, David, Elena, and Sarah escorted by a marshal, who was clearly way outside his comfort zone, but seemed to understand he was witnessing something bigger than protocol. The crowd in the parking lot saw them and erupted, cheering, chanting signs waving. Tom pushed through to the front, his weathered face split in a grin. Thought you could use some moral support, he called over the noise. How did you organize this? David shouted back. I didn't. Started online. People who work in aviation, people who've been scared to speak up about safety concerns, people who just think it's time someone told the truth. Tom's grin faded to something more serious. Your grandfather wasn't the only one who knew something was wrong, David. He was just the only one brave enough to spend his life documenting it. But there are thousands of us mechanics, engineers, pilots who've seen things that didn't make sense, had concerns that got dismissed, watched the industry prioritize profits over safety. You three just gave us permission to stop being silent. A woman pushed forward mid-50s, wearing a pilot's uniform with captain's stripes. I've been flying for 30 years, she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. And I've filed 6 reports about unusual atmospheric conditions at high altitude. Every single one was dismissed as instrument error or pilot confusion. But I knew what I saw. And when Dr. Park's data came out, her voice broke. Thank you. Thank you for proving I wasn't crazy. A young man in mechanics coveralls spoke up. My grandfather worked on Project Overwatch in the 80s. He tried to tell people what he was seeing, and they threatened to revoke his certifications. He died thinking nobody would ever believe him. More voices, more stories, more people who'd been silenced or ignored or told their concerns didn't matter compared to keeping planes in the air and profits flowing. David felt something shift inside him. The weight of isolation he'd carried since his wife died, since his grandfather passed, since he'd started believing he was alone in a world that didn't care about doing things right. He wasn't alone. He'd never been alone. Mr. Chen. Margaret Vance was approaching through the crowd, her expression unreadable. 2 men in expensive suits flanked her corporate lawyers, probably ready to threaten or negotiate, or whatever executives did when their carefully controlled narrative collapsed. But Vance wasn't smiling anymore. She looked tired and maybe a little bit defeated. The board just held an emergency meeting, she said quietly, just loud enough for David, Elena, and Sarah to hear over the crowd noise. I've been authorized to withdraw all charges and issue a formal apology. Volkov Industries will be cooperating fully with FAA investigations, releasing all atmospheric research data to relevant authorities and, she paused, looking at Elena. The board has voted to reinstate you as CEO with full control over research operations effective immediately. Elena's mouth dropped open. What? Turns out your 49% ownership comes with clauses our lawyers missed. Specifically, if the board is found to have engaged in malfeasance or suppression of safety-critical data, you can trigger an emergency restructuring. Vance's smile was brittle. Congratulations. You just staged a hostile takeover using your own company's misconduct as leverage. I never intended. Doesn't matter what you intended. Matters what the lawyers can prove. And right now, every email we sent about delaying Dr. Park's rescue is evidence of negligence at minimum, conspiracy at worst. Vance handed Elena a folder. Your company, Ms. Volkov. Try not to burn it down in the first week. She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at David. For what it's worth, Mr. Chen, your grandfather would be proud. He spent 25 years trying to force us to listen. You managed it in 24 hours. She gestured at the crowd. Turns out people pay attention when you're willing to risk everything. Who knew? After she left, the 3 of them stood together. David, Elena, and Sarah processing what had just happened, while the crowd continued chanting and the news cameras rolled and the world watched. So, Sarah said finally, we saved my life. Exposed, a global conspiracy crashed. The stock market, started a movement, and accidentally gave Elena control of a billion-dollar company. That's insane, Elena finished. That's completely insane. Yeah, David agreed. But we're alive, and the truth is out, and maybe that's enough for one day. Tom pushed through the crowd again, carrying David's grandfather's old toolbox. Thought you might want this, he said, handing it over. Seemed wrong for it to be sitting in the hangar while you were here. David took the toolbox, feeling its familiar weight, and for the first time in 6 years, he felt something like his grandfather's presence not gone. Just transformed into something that lived in everyone who'd been touched by James Chen's stubborn dedication to doing things right. What now? Sarah asked. She was leaning heavily on Elena's exhaustion finally catching up with her body's adrenaline reserves. Now we get you to a hospital, Elena said firmly. And then we figure out how to fix an industry without destroying it. And then, she looked at David, then we finish what our father started. But we do it together, and we do it right, and we don't sacrifice our humanity in the process. Sounds like a plan, David said. They started walking toward the waiting ambulance for Sarah, the crowd parting to let them through. People reached out to touch David's shoulder, shake his hand, thank him for being brave enough to tell the truth. A journalist pushed a microphone toward them. Mr. Chen, what's next for you and Clearwater Airport? David thought about the question about the $8 million he could have had, and the freedom from debt and responsibility that came with it. Then he thought about his grandfather's underground facility, about the analog system that had saved 3 lives, about Tom, and the mechanics and pilots who'd shown up to support them. Next we rebuild, he said simply. We turn Clearwater into what it should have been all along, a research facility that proves we can fly safely in the new reality we've created. We train pilots and mechanics how to work with collapse zones instead of pretending they don't exist. And we make sure that the next time someone like Dr. Park needs help, there's a system in place to actually help them. And your grandfather's research goes public, all of it. No patents, no proprietary secrets, no corporate control. If we're going to solve this problem, everyone needs access to the data. He looked at Elena. Right. She nodded slowly. Right. Starting tomorrow, Volkov Industries becomes an open-source atmospheric research foundation. We'll keep manufacturing aircraft, but the safety research, all of it, goes public domain. Your board will never approve that, the journalist said. Elena smiled, and it was the first genuine smile David had seen from her since she'd crashed onto his runway, what felt like a lifetime ago. I am the board now, she said, and I approve. The ambulance doors closed on Sarah, who was finally allowing herself to acknowledge that 3 weeks of survival at 60,000 feet had taken a toll. But through the window, David could see her giving them a thumbs up, still fighting even while her body was shutting down from exhaustion. Stubborn, Elena muttered affectionately. Runs in the family, apparently, David replied, thinking about his grandfather. The crowd was dispersing now, people heading home or back to work, satisfied that they'd witnessed something important and maybe been part of changing aviation history. Tom lingered, his old face creased with something that looked like peace. Your grandfather would have loved this, Tom said quietly. All those years working alone, dying, thinking he'd failed, and now look, hundreds of people carrying on his work, thousands more who'll benefit from what he built. He clapped David on the shoulder. He didn't fail, son. He just planted seeds that took a while to grow. Thanks, Tom. Don't thank me. Just keep watering those seeds. Tom headed back toward his truck, then called back. And David, next time you decide to steal a jet and fly into a collapse zone, give me more than 6 hours warning. My heart can't take that kind of stress. David laughed. Really laughed for the first time in longer than he could remember. Elena was checking her phone, scrolling through what looked like hundreds of emails and messages. The FAA wants to meet tomorrow. Congress scheduled hearings for next week. And... She looked up, eyes wide. 3 major airlines just contacted me about partnering on atmospheric safety research. They want to help develop solutions before the collapse zones get worse. That's good, right? That's either very good or a trap. With my family's history, I'm not great at telling the difference. She put the phone away. David, I need to ask you something. This partnership we stumbled into. Do you want to make it permanent? Volkov Industries has resources, but you have expertise and instincts I don't. Together we could actually accomplish what our fathers couldn't. David looked at his grandfather's toolbox, then at the Clearwater Airport hangar, visible in the distance, then at this woman who'd crashed into his life and changed everything. On one condition, he said. What's that? We do it from Clearwater. Not some corporate headquarters, not a fancy research facility. We build it here where my grandfather built his foundation, where people remember that good work matters more than impressive offices. Elena extended her hand. Deal. Partners. David shook it. Partners. They stood together in the parking lot as the sun set over Clearwater Regional Airport, 2 people from completely different worlds who'd found common ground in the most unlikely circumstances. Behind them, the Gulf Stream sat on the runway, damaged, barely functional, but proof that sometimes the impossible just needs the right people stubborn enough to try. Tomorrow would bring investigations hearings, corporate restructuring, and the massive undertaking of convincing an entire industry to change course before disaster struck. But tonight, they'd saved a life, exposed a truth that needed exposing, and maybe, just maybe, started something that would actually make a difference. David's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. This is Sarah. Hospital says I need to stay overnight, but I'm already planning what tests we need to run on your grandfather's analog system. When can we start? He showed the text to Elena, who laughed. I like her, Elena said. She's either going to be our greatest asset or drive us completely insane. Why not both? Fair point. They walked toward the airport exit together. David carrying his grandfather's toolbox, Elena already fielding calls from lawyers and board members. Both of them exhausted and terrified, and maybe a little bit excited about what came next. Behind them, Clearwater Regional Airport stood quietly in the fading light, no longer a dying facility at the edge of nowhere, but the epicenter of something that might just change aviation forever. And somewhere, David liked to think his grandfather was watching and nodding approval, satisfied that the seeds he'd planted had finally taken root in soil, willing to let them grow. 6 months later, David Chen stood in front of what used to be Clearwater Regional Airport's derelict hangar and realized his grandfather had been right about almost everything except the timeline. The transformation hadn't taken years. It had taken 23 weeks, 4 days, and more coffee than any human should survive on. Stop admiring your work and get inside, Elena called from the new facility's entrance. She was wearing jeans and a Volkov Atmospheric Research Foundation t-shirt, the official uniform they'd adopted after deciding corporate suits sent the wrong message. The FAA delegation arrives in 30 minutes and you're still covered in hydraulic fluid. David looked down at his coveralls. She wasn't wrong. Inside the facility hummed with activity that would have seemed impossible half a year ago. Where his grandfather's secret underground room had once collected dust, there was now a state-of-the-art atmospheric monitoring center, its walls lined with screens showing real-time data from 73 research stations across North America. But the old equipment remained too carefully preserved and integrated vacuum tubes, glowing amber alongside modern processors, analog gauges positioned next to digital displays, past and present, working together exactly as James Chen had always intended. Sarah Park was at the central console, arguing with 3 engineers about calibration protocols. She'd gained back the weight she'd lost during her ordeal, and then some, and her voice had recovered enough that she could be heard across the entire facility when she was making a point. Which was often. The resonance patterns are off by 0.3%, she was saying. That doesn't sound like much until you're at 60,000 feet, and 0.3% means you miscalculate the collapse zone boundary by 17 miles and fly straight into conditions that will kill you. Dr. Park, we've run the simulations 40 times. Then run them 41 times. We don't launch test flights until I'm satisfied the math is perfect. Sarah caught sight of David and waved him over. Tell them I'm not being unreasonable. You're being completely unreasonable, David said, which is why you're usually right. Run the simulations again. The engineers trudged back to their stations, muttering about perfectionist scientists. Sarah grinned. How's the atmospheric shielding retrofit coming? Ask me after today's test flight. David pulled up a schematic on the nearest screen. We've installed your resonance stabilizers on 12 commercial aircraft. If this works, we prove that flying through collapse zones is possible with the right modifications. If it doesn't work, we crash another expensive jet, and I spend another 3 weeks waiting for rescue. Sarah's tone was light, but David caught the tension in her shoulders. She still had nightmares about those 3 weeks alone. Probably always would. Nobody's crashing, Elena said, joining them. She'd changed into a clean shirt and pulled her hair back, looking every inch the CEO she'd reluctantly become. The test pilot is ex-Air Force, trained on your grandfather's analog systems, and cautious to the point of paranoia. Plus, we have 3 chase planes with full rescue capabilities standing by. Which costs us how much per hour? David asked. More than I want to think about, but less than a wrongful death lawsuit. Elena checked her watch. FAA delegation in 20 minutes. Are we ready? They weren't, not really. You were never ready to present research that challenged 70 years of aviation orthodoxy to the same regulatory body that had been ignoring warnings about collapse zones since David's grandfather first documented them. But ready or not, the moment was here. The delegation arrived precisely on time. 5 FAA officials, 2 NTSB investigators, and a woman David recognized from congressional hearings as Senator Patricia Morrison, chair of the Commerce Committee's Aviation Subcommittee. They looked around the facility with expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Mr. Chen. The lead FAA official, a man named Richard Keller, extended a hand without warmth. Quite an operation you've built here, though I notice you're still operating on temporary experimental certificates. Those expire in, he made a show of checking his tablet, 48 days. We're aware, David said evenly. And you're proposing that commercial aviation adopt these atmospheric shielding systems based on 6 months of research, despite the fact that the industry's own scientists haven't been able to replicate your collapse zone predictions with any consistency. That's because the industry's scientists are using models that assume atmospheric stability, Sarah interjected, which is like trying to predict earthquakes while assuming the Earth's crust is solid and unchanging. The models are fundamentally wrong. Dr. Park, with respect, your credentials are in atmospheric chemistry, not aviation safety. With respect, Sarah's voice went cold. I spent 3 weeks in a collapse zone that your models said didn't exist. I'm pretty sure my credentials are written in survival. Senator Morrison raised a hand. Let's keep this civil. We're here to evaluate the research, not debate credentials. Mr. Chen, why don't you show us what you've built? The tour took 90 minutes. David walked them through the monitoring network, explained how his grandfather's analog systems provided redundancy when modern electronics failed, demonstrated the resonance stabilizers that Sarah had developed based on atmospheric data that proved collapse zones weren't just areas of degradation, but standing wave patterns that could be navigated with the right approach. Keller remained skeptical throughout, asking pointed questions designed to expose weaknesses, but Senator Morrison paid close attention, particularly when they reached the memorial wall where David had installed photographs of everyone who'd contributed to the research, his grandfather front and center, flanked by Elena's father, by Sarah, by Tom, by dozens of mechanics and pilots and engineers who'd spent years documenting problems they'd been told didn't exist. My father was a commercial pilot for 32 years, Morrison said quietly, studying James Chen's photograph. He filed 17 reports about unusual atmospheric conditions between 1987 and his retirement in 2003. Every single one was dismissed. He died last year, still angry that nobody had listened. I'm sorry, David said. Don't be sorry. Show me you can fix it. She turned to face him. Because here's the reality, Mr. Chen. The aviation industry is in crisis. Passenger confidence is down 40%. 3 major airlines are bankrupt. Another 5 are teetering on the edge. Everyone's screaming for solutions, but nobody trusts anyone because of the cover-up. You 3, she gestured at David, Elena, and Sarah, are the only people who've been right so far. So either prove your atmospheric shielding works, or admit we're looking at the end of commercial aviation as we know it. No pressure, Sarah muttered. Enormous pressure, Morrison corrected, which is appropriate given what's at stake. Elena stepped forward. Senator, the test flight is scheduled for this afternoon. We'll be flying through the same collapse zone where Dr. Park was stranded using a commercial aircraft retrofitted with our full suite of modifications. If the systems work as predicted, the flight will demonstrate that safe high-altitude aviation is still possible. And if they don't work, then we'll have very expensive footage of our failure that will probably end this whole enterprise and prove the skeptics right. Elena's voice was steady despite the stakes. But I don't think we're going to fail. And even if we do, at least we'll have tried something, instead of just watching the industry collapse while everyone argues about who's to blame. Keller started to object, but Morrison cut him off. I want to observe the test flight. All of us do. If Mr. Chen's modifications work, I'll personally sponsor legislation requiring their adoption across the commercial fleet. If they don't, she shrugged, then at least we'll know, and we can focus on other solutions. You're welcome to observe, David said, but the flight leaves in 2 hours and we're not delaying it. Understood. They spent the next 2 hours in what David mentally categorized as controlled chaos. Pre-flight checks on the test aircraft, a retrofitted Boeing 737 that belonged to a regional airline desperate enough to risk their equipment on unproven technology. Final systems verification on the atmospheric shielding, coordination with the 3 chase planes that would shadow the test flight and provide rescue capability if something went wrong. Tom found David in the hangar, checking the retrofit installation one final time. The old ground crew chief looked worried, which was unusual for someone who'd seen 60 years of aviation emergencies. You sure about this, son? No, David admitted. But I'm sure about the math, and I'm sure we don't have a choice. If we don't prove this works, everything we've built shuts down. The FAA revokes our experimental certificates, and the aviation industry goes back to pretending collapse zones don't exist until the first major disaster. Your grandfather would say that's a lot of weight to put on one test flight. My grandfather put 25 years of weight on his research and died before anyone listened. I figure one test flight is getting off light. David closed the access panel he'd been inspecting and turned to face Tom. Besides, I'm not doing this alone. I've got Sarah's science, Elena's resources, and 73 monitoring stations feeding us real-time data. Grandpa worked in isolation. We're working as a team. That's a nice speech. You almost convinced me you're not terrified. Oh, I'm terrified. I'm just doing it anyway. Tom chuckled. Yeah, you're definitely James Chen's grandson. The test pilot was named Marcus Webb, 48 years old, 25 years of military and commercial flight experience, and according to Elena's hiring notes, someone who'd been blacklisted by 2 major airlines for filing too many safety reports, which made him perfect for what they needed. Aircraft's clean, Webb said, completing his walk-around inspection. Your retrofit work is solid. Not pretty, but solid. Pretty doesn't keep you alive at 60,000 feet, David replied. Truth. Webb climbed into the cockpit where Sarah was already strapped into the co-pilot's seat over the strenuous objections of about 15 different people who thought sending the scientist who'd barely survived a collapse zone back into one was insane. I need to see how the systems perform in real conditions, Sarah had argued. And I'm the only person who knows what to look for when things start going wrong. Elena had eventually agreed, but only after making Sarah promise to bail out at the first sign of serious trouble. Which Sarah had agreed to, though everyone suspected she'd interpret serious trouble very differently than anyone else would. David stood in the control tower, the old one, because he'd insisted on keeping it operational alongside the new facility and watched the Boeing taxi to the runway. The FAA delegation was crowded into the small space, with him, Senator Morrison, front and center. Everyone's attention fixed on the aircraft and the data screens showing atmospheric conditions in the collapse zone. Collapse zone boundary is stable at 58,000 feet. One of the technicians reported, electromagnetic interference patterns within predicted parameters. Resonance frequency is... He paused, rechecking his instruments. That can't be right. David's stomach dropped. What can't be right? The zone's grown since our last measurement 6 hours ago. It's now extending down to 54,000 feet and up to 63,000. That's a 9,000-foot expansion in 6 hours. Jesus, Elena breathed. She'd come up to the tower to watch the flight. Sarah's theoretical models predicted accelerating expansion, but not this fast. Abort the flight, Keller asked, and David heard the hope in his voice. Hope that the test would be canceled and he could recommend shutting down the whole project. No, David said. The aircraft's rated for those altitudes. We adjust the flight plan and proceed. Mr. Chen, if the zone's expanding that rapidly, then we need to know if our modifications can handle it. David keyed the radio. Webb, did you copy that last transmission? Copied. Zone's bigger than expected. Adjusting flight plan to compensate. Webb's voice was calm, professional. Dr. Park, you still comfortable proceeding? Sarah's voice came back immediately. Absolutely. This is actually better data. We'll be testing the systems under more extreme conditions than anticipated. That's one way to look at it, Webb said dryly. Tower requesting clearance for departure. Cleared for takeoff, David replied, his mouth dry. Godspeed. The Boeing rolled down the runway and lifted off smoothly, climbing into afternoon sky that looked deceptively peaceful. The chase planes followed at staggered altitudes, ready to respond if the test flight got into trouble. David watched the aircraft climb through 30,000 feet, 40,000, 50,000. The radio chatter was professional, calm routine right up until they hit 54,000 feet and entered the collapse zone boundary. Primary navigation just flickered, Webb reported, switching to atmospheric shielding systems now. On the data screens, David watched the resonance stabilizers activate, creating what Sarah called bubble of normalized space around the aircraft. The theory was sound use controlled resonance to reinforce the atmospheric structure, locally preventing the electromagnetic chaos of the collapse zone from disrupting aircraft systems. The theory was sound. Whether it actually worked was about to be tested. Stabilizers are active, Sarah's voice came through. Resonance frequency locked at optimal. Electromagnetic interference is a pause. It's working. David, it's actually working. We're inside the zone and all systems are green. The control tower erupted in barely controlled celebration. Even Keller looked grudgingly impressed. Senator Morrison was on her phone immediately, probably already drafting the legislation she'd promised. But David kept watching the screens because they weren't done yet. The real test wasn't flying into the zone, it was staying there long enough to prove the modifications provided sustained protection. Proceeding to waypoint Alpha, Webb reported. That's where Dr. Park's aircraft was stranded. We'll hold position there for 15 minutes, collect comparative data, then return. 15 minutes. 15 minutes to prove that everything David's grandfather had worked for, everything they'd built over the past 6 months, everything they'd risked and lost and fought for, 15 minutes to prove it was all worth it. The first 10 minutes were textbook perfect. The Boeing held position in the collapse zone, its systems humming along on the protection provided by the atmospheric shielding. Sarah was reading off data points with growing excitement, comparing real-time conditions to her theoretical models, and discovering they matched almost perfectly. Then at minute 11, something changed. Resonance frequency is shifting. Sarah said, her excitement replaced by concern. The zone's natural frequency is modulating. It's, oh God, it's adapting. Adapting to what? David demanded. To our stabilizers. The collapse zone is a standing wave pattern, and we're introducing interference. It's compensating by shifting frequency to maintain stability. Sarah's voice was rising. David, it's like the atmosphere is alive and trying to reject foreign objects. We need to adjust our frequency to match the radio cut out. Webb, do you copy? David called. Sarah, anyone, static. On the data screens, he watched the Boeing's telemetry feed flicker and die. The chase planes were reporting they'd lost visual contact as electromagnetic interference intensified. Get them out of there, Keller said. Emergency recall immediately. We can't recall them if they can't hear us, Elena snapped. She was already at a computer terminal pulling up atmospheric models. David, if Sarah's right about frequency adaptation, they need to adjust the stabilizers to match the zone's new frequency. Can they do that manually? If Sarah figures out the right frequency and Webb can input it into the system, yes. But without radio contact, they're on their own, Elena finished. The tower fell silent, except for the static hiss of dead radio frequencies. 60 seconds passed. 90. 2 minutes. Everyone was thinking the same thing. History repeating another scientist trapped in a collapse zone, except this time they'd sent her back deliberately. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, Sarah's voice burst through the static. Adjusted frequency to match harmonic repeat. We've compensated for zone adaptation, and all systems are stable. Webb is bringing us home. The relief in the tower was palpable. David found himself gripping the edge of the console hard enough to hurt, forcing himself to breathe. What happened up there? He asked when his voice was steady enough to trust. The collapse zone tried to kill us. I did some very fast math, and Captain Webb has the steadiest hands I've ever seen. Sarah sounded exhilarated rather than scared. David, we just proved something huge. The zones aren't just static phenomena, they're dynamic systems that respond to interference, which means your modifications aren't a permanent solution. Keller interrupted, his skepticism returning. If the zones adapt to your shielding, then every aircraft will need constant frequency adjustments, which is impossible to coordinate across a commercial fleet. Not impossible, Sarah countered. Complicated, yes. But we can develop adaptive systems that automatically adjust to match the zone's frequency. It's just software, not physics. We can solve this. The Boeing emerged from the collapse zone at 53,000 feet and began its descent. Webb's voice came through clearly now. Tower test flight complete. All systems performed within acceptable parameters once we compensated for frequency adaptation. Requesting priority landing clearance because Dr. Park wants to start analyzing data immediately, and I'm scared she'll try to land this thing herself if I don't comply. Cleared to land runway 31. David replied, grinning, despite the tension still coiled in his chest. And Webb, thank you. Both of you. Buy me dinner and we'll call it even, Webb said. The landing was smooth, and the moment the Boeing rolled to a stop, Sarah was out of her seat and heading for the cabin door with her tablet already reviewing data and muttering calculations. Webb followed more slowly, looking like someone who'd just aged 10 years in 15 minutes. That woman is brilliant and terrifying, he told David. Possibly in that order. During the frequency adaptation crisis, she did differential equations in her head while the aircraft was shaking apart around us, and the electromagnetic interference was making my teeth hurt. Sounds like Sarah, Elena said. She'd run down from the tower to meet them. Did we get everything we need? You got proof that your modifications work and proof that the problem's more complicated than anyone thought. Webb pulled off his headset and handed it to David. You also got me interested in consulting for your operation full-time, assuming you're hiring test pilots who are too stubborn to know when they're taking on something impossible. We're always hiring those, David said. Senator Morrison was approaching with her entourage, her expression unreadable. The FAA delegation trailed behind Keller, looking like he'd bitten into something sour. Mr. Chen, that was... Morrison paused, choosing her words carefully. That was the most terrifying and impressive demonstration I've ever witnessed. Your modifications work, But Dr. Park's discovery about frequency adaptation means implementing this across commercial aviation is going to be exponentially more complex than anyone anticipated. Yes, David agreed. But possible. That's the key word, possible. 6 months ago, everyone said flying through collapse zones was impossible. Now we've proven it's just difficult. Difficult we can work with. My office will be drafting legislation requiring all commercial aircraft to be retrofitted with atmospheric shielding within 18 months, Morrison said. The FAA will work with your facility to develop certification standards, and Mr. Chen, she extended her hand, your grandfather would be proud. You didn't just continue his work, you finished it. We finished it, David corrected, gesturing at Sarah Elena Tom Webb and the dozens of engineers and technicians who'd made the test flight possible. Nobody does this alone. After the delegation left, after the celebration died down, after Sarah had finally been convinced to sleep for the first time in 36 hours, David found himself back in his grandfather's underground facility. Elena was there too, sitting at the desk where James Chen had written his final journals. Your board's probably having a coronary about the implementation costs, David said. Probably, but they'll pay them. Elena was reading one of the grandfather's old notebooks, her finger tracing the precise engineering script. You know what your grandfather wrote in here? He said, sometimes the most important work is the work you never finish, because it proves the work matters enough to continue. Sounds like him. He also wrote about you, a lot. She turned the notebook to show David a page dated 3 months before James Chen died. He said, David thinks he's just a mechanic, but he's wrong. He's a keeper of knowledge, a bridge between what was and what will be. Someday he'll understand that fixing broken things isn't a small life. It's the foundation everything else is built on. David felt his throat tighten. He never said anything like that to me. Because you weren't ready to hear it. But you are now. Elena closed the notebook carefully. David, we need to talk about what comes next. The FAA certification process will take months. Implementation across the commercial fleet will take years. And the collapse zones are going to keep growing, keep adapting. This isn't a problem we solve and walk away from. This is a career, a life's work. I know. And you're okay with that, spending the rest of your life on atmospheric research instead of, she gestured vaguely, whatever else you might have done. David thought about his wife Sarah, about the medical debt that had nearly destroyed him, about the years he'd spent thinking his life was over and nothing he did would matter. Then he thought about the past 6 months, the rescue, the research, the test flight, the moment when they'd proven the impossible was just difficult, and difficult was something they could handle. My grandfather spent 25 years on this and died thinking he'd failed, David said finally. My wife died thinking I could do anything even after I'd proved I couldn't save her. And 6 months ago, a woman crashed a jet onto my runway because she believed I was the person who could help her save someone's life. He met Elena's eyes. I spent a lot of years thinking I was just a mechanic fixing crop dusters. But maybe I'm a mechanic who helps keep the sky from falling. That feels like enough of a life's work. Elena smiled. Yeah, it does. They sat together in the underground facility, surrounded by decades of research and sacrifice and stubborn dedication to doing things right, despite impossible odds. Above them, Clearwater Regional Airport, now the Clearwater Atmospheric Research Foundation, hummed with activity that would continue long after both of them were gone. Outside, Tom was closing up the old hangar for the night, probably muttering about crazy scientists and mechanics who didn't know when to quit. Sarah was already planning the next round of tests, her laptop open despite exhaustion because sleep was less important than data. Webb was filling out paperwork to officially join the team, probably wondering what he'd gotten himself into. And somewhere in Washington, Senator Morrison was drafting legislation that would transform how the world thought about aviation safety, built on the foundation of a small-town mechanic and his grandfather's refusal to accept that some problems were too big to solve. David's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah can't sleep. Too excited about adaptive frequency algorithms. When can we start testing? He showed it to Elena, who laughed. She's going to kill herself with overwork. Or save commercial aviation. Possibly both. Definitely both. David stood picking up his grandfather's old toolbox. It had sat in this facility for years, waiting for someone to understand its significance. Now it would sit in the new facility upstairs, a reminder that every breakthrough started with simple tools and the willingness to use them. "Come on," he said to Elena. "Let's go upstairs and start planning phase 2. Because if Sarah's already working, we're falling behind." They climbed the stairs together, leaving the underground facility dark, except for the soft amber glow of vacuum tubes still monitoring atmospheric conditions, still collecting data, still doing the patient work that his grandfather had started, and that would continue long after everyone involved was forgotten. At the top of the stairs, David paused and looked back into the darkness. "Thanks, Grandpa," he said quietly. "For the tools, for the research, for believing I'd figure it out eventually." And maybe it was his imagination, but he could have sworn he heard his grandfather's voice one final time. "You did good, son. Now keep doing good." David closed the door and headed into the facility, where Sarah was already arguing with engineers about test protocols, where Elena was fielding calls from airlines, desperate for solutions, where Tom was making terrible coffee, and Webb was asking questions about atmospheric physics he probably didn't really care about, but was too professional not to understand. This was his life now. Not the small, safe life he'd resigned himself to after his wife died. Not the isolated existence his grandfather had endured. But something bigger, messier, more complicated, and infinitely more meaningful. A life spent fixing broken things with people who believed broken things were worth fixing. 6 months ago, a woman had crashed a $78 million jet onto his runway because she needed help saving a life. Tonight they'd proven that help was possible, that problems everyone said were unsolvable could be solved with the right combination of old knowledge and new thinking, and people stubborn enough to keep trying after everyone else had quit. Tomorrow they'd start again, more tests, more research, more impossible challenges that would probably take years to overcome. But that was fine. David Chen was a mechanic, a keeper of knowledge, a bridge between what was and what would be. And he'd learned from the best that the most important work was the work you never finished, because it proved the work mattered enough to continue. He had his grandfather's tools, Sarah's brilliance, Elena's resources, and a team of people who understood that sometimes saving the world started with fixing one broken thing at a time. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.